Thank you. The final speaker is Alex Sayer, and I just want to introduce Alex because one of the more exciting things that's happened over the last few weeks for me was when I was reading the papers and I read about young, scruffy former students who had completely disrupted the workfare plans of this government. I want to introduce Alex as one of the scruffy former student workfare activists from Right to Work. Alex.
Thanks. I did try to brush up for this event, but right, I'm going to start by just highlighting what exactly the workfare schemes are, because a lot of people are unclear about what they are. There are actually 5 workfare schemes at the moment. There is the mandatory the mandatory work activity, which pretty much does what it says on the tin. The work program, and that's the one that was mainly focused on in the media, which was supposedly voluntary, but we'll get onto that. The Community Action Programme, which can last for up to 6 months, sector-based work academies, and work experience, which is similar to the work programme, but specifically aimed at 16 to 24-year-olds, and that was when us scruffy former students were saying that we wouldn't do it. The government is pretty slippery about defining these because it makes it easier for them to say, oh, it's not mandatory, it's not mandatory. Well, actually, 3 of the 5 workfare schemes are mandatory. And I think the biggest fallacy is that any of these are voluntary schemes. All of them use sanctions, in this case, or the removal of welfare, to compel people to take unpaid work. And not only that, those that refuse to take part in the so-called voluntary schemes are then referred on to the mandatory schemes, for which the sanctions for not taking part are much greater. So this means that by refusing to work for free in jobs that you have no interest in taking a part in, the unemployed can lose their benefits for up to 3 months, and when you don't have an income coming in, it's devastating. So the government, of course, is claiming that these schemes work and that over half of those forced into workfare schemes are coming out with jobs at the end of it, but these figures simply aren't true. They are referring to the number of people who stop claiming benefits at the end of it, and actually the proportion is the same, and actually slightly better for those that do not take part in the workfare schemes. And in fact, in 2008, the Department for Work and Pensions researched workfare in other countries and came to the conclusion that there is little evidence that workfare increases the likelihood of finding work and that it can even reduce employment chances. So I think that kind of says it all, really. The number of unemployed is currently standing at over 2.6 million, but the TUC suggested that the real figure could actually be over 6 million because the figures don't take into account those in training, those no longer eligible to claim benefits, and it, of course, ignores the underemployed. And things, unfortunately, aren't really looking up either because it's predicted that over 500,000 public sector jobs over the next 5 years will be lost. And the private sector, as we've seen, isn't really picking up the slack as it promised. But mass unemployment is pretty much as old as capitalism itself, and having it and using it as an excuse to drive down benefits because of the supposed lack of funding means that also bosses can drive down wages. Those in jobs are overworked and told that they have to work longer hours for less, for more years, and those who aren't in jobs are just completely abandoned. I think Marx puts it best when he says, the condemnation of one part of the working class to enforce idleness by the overwork of the other part becomes a means of enriching the ruling class. So it is transparently obvious that workfare has been put in place not because it serves the interests of the unemployed, because we've seen that that's just not true, and even the Department for Work and Pensions admits it, but is a way of big businesses being able to pull themselves out of the financial crisis on the backs of the unemployed. And it also manages to conveniently stigmatize benefit users at the same time as those are too lazy or too feckless to work. But I think this transparent unfairness is why Right to Work has had such a successful campaign, because, how can you disagree with what we're doing? So what are politicians doing about the unemployment crisis? Well, they're blaming it on the jobless, both outright and through more implicit tactics. Maria Miller said, I think a couple months ago, that there is no shortage of jobs and that unemployment was caused by a lack of appetite for work, which, yeah. And this is also the Minister for the Disabled, and we know what she's been doing to represent the interests and needs of that demographic. So, I mean, it doesn't really come as a surprise that she's once again vilifying users of benefits. But we also know that there are an average of 6 people looking for every 1 job that is available. So the problem isn't a lack of appetite for work, it's just simply that there are no jobs. So Stuart Rose, former chairman of Marks and Spencer's, told parents a few months ago to effectively get their children to suck it up and go to work. This was in reference to the work experience scheme, the one specifically for young people. He used himself as an example of someone who had brought himself up from sweeping the shop floor to being a big boss, and sometimes we have to do jobs that we don't want to do. And this was in reference to Ian Duncan Smith calling those who are protesting against workfare job snobs. I think his full line was, "I'd rather be a shelf stacker than a job snob." Well, I have 2 things to say to both of them. But firstly, Stuart Rose, you were on a management trainee scheme, so you weren't doing it for free. In all likelihood, you're probably getting paid a manager's wage to sweep that shop floor. And secondly, it is not snobbery to say that you do not want to be forced into a job that you do not want to do and not get paid for it. I mean, that is simply 21st century slave labor. So, if they want to come round to my house and clean my toilet for free, then I will hold up my hands and say that I have been a job snob, but so far that has not happened, so I'm not going to hold my breath. The stigmatization of benefit users has been going on for a while, and it is frequently trotted out in times of crisis to lay the blame of the crisis at the feet of working people. Benefits are now being implemented through an expensive bureaucracy that tries to divide and classify workers as either deserving or undeserving of their benefits. And this is sort of followed through from the 90s Tory rhetoric about welfare underclass. Sure. And blah, blah, blah. I'll skip forward because I'm going slower than I thought I would. And somehow, this is talk about the benefits dependency, is used as a way of defending those who are seemingly more deserving recipients. So it gives the Tories a sort of veneer of compassion that they're saving the welfare system for those that really need it, and let's get all these scroungers off it. And it's still happening. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith said it just the other week. But this undercloth is, of course, a myth. We all know that. The fact is that we are simply in an economic crisis where most people are going in and out of employment and rely on benefits for short periods of time. And this is because work is sporadic, not because there is no will to work. And work is sporadic not because there is no work ethic, but because, as we've seen, there are simply no jobs. So there's the doom and gloom. And now I'm going to move on to the slightly more upbeat part of my talk about what we've been doing at Right to Work, and it's actually been a massive success. And other campaigns have been doing similar things, and it's all been really successful. Number 1, we got the Tories on the back foot. We had Chris Grayling contradicting himself one day to another. First he's saying, oh, there are no sanctions, it's voluntary, and then the very next day he goes on television and says, well, in order to save these schemes, we've removed sanctions. So what is it? And I think all of this red baiting, it was actually quite nice because it means they're afraid. We really put the wind up them. I mean, they were pretty scared. And we've had a large amount of support. I've never been on a campaign where we've had so much support. We occupied a McDonald's in Liverpool Street Station in February, and we actually had customers joining in, chanting with us. I've never experienced that before in my life. And organising locally at my local job centres was really, really inspiring. People were really behind us, and apart from those that seemed to think that I was trying to get them to work for free, but I think that's just more on how I need to work on my approach. But I think it's because it's a situation that everyone can relate to. Everyone either knows someone unemployed or, is using the welfare system, and it's all being cut. We also proved that we proved something that people previously thought was impossible. We managed to organise the unemployed. People said that, you can't do it. The unemployed will never get organised. Well, not only did they get organised, they got angry, they got involved in a massive campaign, and they got angry enough to question not only what was going on with the workfare schemes, but also why they were unemployed in the first place, and to stand up and say, this is not my fault, and I will not feel shame for accepting benefits because I am unemployed, because I do not want to be in this position. And we've had some massive successes. We have got massive companies to pull out of the workfare scheme. We had a relatively small demonstration that kicked it off in Tesco Metro outside Westminster, and there really weren't that many of us. I'll hold up my hands and say it. There are probably only about 12 of us. But a few days later, Tesco's pulled out of the scheme. I think it's incredible, but I think what we really... Oh, thank you. Thank you. But we couldn't have done it without the support and the confidence given to us by other workers' struggles. I mean, look at the electricians dispute. They pulled down multinational companies, they brought them to their knees, and that's the sort of thing that gives us the confidence to go out and fight and win, and that's really what we all need to do. And most importantly, workers and unemployed coming together over these issues is what really strengthens our cause. A lot of this benefits witch hunting is done as a divide and rule tactic. To distract us from the real scroungers in this country, who we all know are Osborne and Cameron and their billionaire banker friends who are avoiding all of their taxes. So I think that's why it's so important to build networks like this together. I think this is just an incredible conference. I'm really in awe of it. And these are the sort of networks that we're really going to need to beat back these attacks on our welfare system. So thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank each of the speakers. We're not going to have an open session now. We're just going to bring conference to an end.